Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this workshop on trade and environment linkages. What are the effects on decent work? I'm Marva Corley, senior economist and head of the globalization team in the research department, and I have the great pleasure of moderating this session today. This workshop is part of the Trade, Environment, and Labor Market Project with the acronym of TRENLA that is headed up by my colleague, Pauline Secular-Risciardi. This is a very important topic for the team's work on trade, as often environment and labor issues are included in trade as part of sustainability efforts. It's also important for the ILO in the context of its mandate to consider all international economic and financial policies and measures in light of its fundamental objective of lasting peace and social justice. Among the significant challenges facing the world of work in pursuit of this obligation, globalization and environmental degradation stand out as foremost concerns. So today, the aim of this workshop is to bring together presenters from the international community, from within the ILO, to explore these multifaceted challenges. But it's also an opportunity to look at the intersection of trade, environmental sustainability, and decent work. The discussions here today hopefully will pave the way for a more cohesive policy framework that integrates these very crucial elements and move us toward a more sustainable green transition. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Mustafa Kamal Gay. Mustafa is the director of the ILO Priority Action Program on Just Transitions toward Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies. And I'd just like to mention that before joining the ILO, Mustafa was the head of the Green Economy Advisory Services at UNEP, but he also was a senior manager at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development in Geneva. So he does wear a dual hat of both trade and environmental issues. So I'd like to turn over the floor to Mustafa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marva, and good morning, colleagues. I'm pleased to join you at this workshop on this topic, which is very dear to me. As you said, I first came to Geneva. I was recruited from Japan to come and set up a program on trade and environment in the context of the WTO negotiations in the Doha round. And so I followed that work through UNEP Economics and Trade branch in Geneva here before my transfer to the ILO in the action program. So colleagues, we know that environmental policies have socio-economic consequences that go beyond their mere environmental impacts. And these include impacts on jobs and working conditions. So this is why the ILO recognizes that the unintended consequences of green policies for jobs, decent work, and sustainable development are important and issues that we need to pay attention to. So these policies taken by individual countries can have ripple effects on the economies, labor markets, and trade dynamics in other countries. Similarly, increased globalization and trade policies can significantly impact environmental sustainability and employment. And in fact, this was why the Doha round in the WTO introduced an environmental agenda. And I also want to mention that in the context of the UN climate change negotiations, there is a specific work stream looking at the socio-economic impacts of mitigation policies in particular. So within the UNFCCC, there is a committee of experts known as the Katowice Committee of Experts on the impact of the implementation of response measures. And that is the UNFCCC body, which is focusing on decent work and just transition dimensions of climate action. So the ILO happens to be currently the co-chair of that committee together with Ghana. And I was actually last week in Accra for the 11th session of the KCI. And part of the issues the KCI is dealing with is the trade effects of response measures, both within domestic jurisdictions and the extraterritorial impacts. So in particular, developing countries pay a lot of attention to the extraterritorial impacts of mitigation measures. And I should say, it's a very controversial issue. It's a lot of tensions. And that's why we are looking at a number of case studies. And I think I was telling Pelen this morning that this study could be of interest because in the KCI, in our work program, we've just launched a call for submission of case studies looking at the socio-economic impacts of the implementation of response measures. And some of the case studies that we are considering are actually dealing with the socio-economic impacts beyond domestic jurisdictions. But back to here in the ILO, the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work, which was adopted in 2019, recognizes this complex relationship between trade, environment, and social policies, and the role that the ILO needs to play to promote policy coherence among different areas. And you may also remember, you may recall that last year, the International Labour Conference had a general discussion on the topics of a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all, with a resolution that is also mandating the ILO to engage in promoting policy coherence across multilateral environmental processes in relation to the decent work agenda. However, the studies and research that analyze the links between globalization, environmental policies, and the labor markets in a holistic way are very scarce. Given the importance of policymaking, of understanding these interactions and competing effects, there is a need for more research. The ILO can contribute to policy coherence for a just transition by providing evidence-based policy-relevant research, which takes into account these different dimensions of the environmental transition, including its links with trade. It is also crucial to bring together experts from the trade, environment, and labor communities to share knowledge and different perspectives. So that's why this event that brings us together is of crucial importance. And I very much look forward to our discussion today. And thank you for having me with you on these topics, which I said is very dear to me personally. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa, particularly for reminding us of some of the unintended consequences of specific policies, especially those linked to environmental sustainability, and bringing it back to some of the discussions within the WTO, especially when thinking about multilateral trade, because here we've been talking a lot about regional trade, but it's really important to bring home some of the issues that are really at the core of multilateral trade discussions. So I would at this point like to introduce the first presenter or discussant for this workshop. That is Diane Vivian Barraclough. We've had some discussions about the pronunciation of the last name, and there is a poem about it, apparently. Diana is a senior economist at UNCTAD, and she's leading research on international finance and development. We had the pleasure of working with Diana and co-author Gul on a chapter in the recent report on integrating trade and decent work. Diana's research involves development finance, green industrial and financial policies, and the path out of fossil fuel dependency. Please, Diana, the floor is yours.
I got my microphone on. I'm just putting my timer on because I can't see the chair. So I've given myself a 5-minute timer. I'm allowed 10 apparently, but I do want to leave some time for my co-author. So thank you very much for welcoming us to this event. I will be drawing on the chapter co-authored by Gul Unal, who's also in the room, and myself for your excellent 2-volume publication last year, and also drawing on our annual trade and development report, which I hope you're familiar with, where we've been looking at really the questions that are central to this workshop too, on how to better align climate responses and development. So this alignment between the two things, climate and development. And sustainability when it comes to the environment and when it comes to climate responses, they must also include economic sustainability and equity and justice to get the political buy-in at every level for the changes that are desired for climate change response and also for development. And decent work is really at the core of this as well, because if work opportunities are not decent, then the employment will not be sustainable long-term, and it won't have that transformative impact that's been pledged in the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, to which all countries, of which both our institutions are members, our countries have signed this. So today's papers, which I'm really looking forward to hearing shortly, they focus on the circular economy and also green measures in exporting firms. And at the heart of both these two elements, move to circular economy, reuse, recycle, redesign, and then green measures for exporters. At the heart of this is a search for structural transformation in terms of the products that we make and the processes by which we make them. And this impacts not only on exports, actually it impacts on everything, because it's going to impact domestic production and consumption as well. So how is this going to be achieved? There's a very ambitious transformation of how we've been doing things for, what's at least 100 years now of, a modern mechanistic fossil fuel dependent economy. So this workshop rightly insists that there's multiple channels through which the transition to a green economy and trade and decent work interact. And I want to focus in particular on UNCTAD messaging about what's called a Green New Deal approach and also a positive trade agenda. So bringing these two elements. Now, today, when we talk about the Green New Deal, we're mostly focusing on environmental issues. But let's not forget that the original New Deal, brought in by Roosevelt in the 1930s, was very much about addressing economic impact of environmental degradation, about job creation and income redistribution, and it involved huge investment and huge employment policies. It was a really massive, massive deal. And this multi-purpose element of the redistribution, the work, the environment, and also the money behind it all, this multi-purpose element is essential today, and even more so because of how interconnected we are through trade. Now, since 2020, WTO members began a series of structured discussions to analyze and advocate for trade proposals that would help shift to a more sustainable environment. And these trade proposals included liberalizing environmental goods and services trade, reducing, the word phasing out, harmful subsidies, especially for fossil fuels, which not only impact consumption and production, they're driving a huge amount of global trade. The CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, to reduce carbon trade and use, and currently, right now, a global policy to reduce plastic pollution, and other measures to create the circular economy that we'll be discussing today. And in 2021, the G7 Trade Ministers Communique insists that trade must be part of the solution. Now, UNCTAD research has highlighted some essential agendas for what we call a positive trade agenda for this. The first messaging would be that this needs to be global, including regional elements to global agreements. And we really are concerned if it's splintering into bilateral and unilateral agreements. Gul may wish to address this when I finished. The second main issue that we want to think about is that while all countries may wish to be greener, and they've signed up to pledges to be greener, they don't, okay, that's my 5 minutes. They don't have the same capacity to act. So trade policies may be welcome and long overdue when it comes to health and pollution and climate change, but they can also cause shocks to economies. Not only the shock of the trade policy itself, but all the other elements that come with it. So if uncoordinated shocks, for example, can lead to insurance companies, pensions, banks, firms, the people who were previously viable in the now problematic regime system will suffer. New people will be winners. How do we manage this change between those who gain and those who lose? And the ripple effect of gaining and losing can be extreme. This positive agenda therefore links employment and environment and trade and income support to sectors and workers in transition. Sunk assets or sinking assets are also humans. And we want to be very concerned about the social, cultural, and human effects of our efforts to achieve a goal that, in fact, everybody is wanting. Now, one element that UNCTAD is pushing for is that we should have open source and patent-free technologies when it comes to green trade, for example, green technology. We should have climate-smart infrastructure. We should have waves and peace clauses that recognize the differential responsibilities and capacities of developing countries. So this brings a starting point of what we call special and differential treatment in trade, but also the common plus differentiated responsibilities when it comes to the UNFCCC. Now, UNCTAD has recommended, therefore, that developing countries really need to have this policy space for transition. Ultimately, though, all countries are wanting to transition and they're wanting to transform. And in this, trade policy is only going to be one element. We also will have the need for money, massive amounts of money, big investment on a very, very large scale to meet not only the demands of trade policy, but also the demands of environmental regulations, labor regulations, market demand. There's a lot of things pushing us to this desired goal with some obstacles that we need to address. So the other element of the Global Green New Deal is the money. It's a lot. It's the biggest investment push in history. Now, we know that it's going to cost a minimum of $4 trillion a year to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate goals. At one level, this doesn't look like a very big deal. It's only 1% of the total value of global financial assets. So there's a kind of a narrative that says, hey, this should be quite easy. We can just divert what's only 1%, that's going to be pretty straightforward and easy, isn't it? But it's not easy, and it's proved incredibly difficult. We're not reaching any of the climate goals that have been pledged. We're not reaching ODA goals that have been pledged. We're still spending $1.3 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies. It's very difficult to move that, although that fund could be used to help pay for green transformation. So UNCTAD is arguing that we really need to fully benefit from and use the public banking system. There's 45 multilateral development banks. There's more than 400 public banks. And these are the institutions that are owned by governments. These are policy tools owned by governments that are doing the heavy lifting required to help countries meet the new demands for trade, but also the new demands for domestic environment and employment as well. So we would argue that we need to strongly support the development banks for this role. And they then need support from industrial policy to create the demand for all of this. So this is my final statement, is bringing all this together, these interlinking elements of the money, the trade policy, the industrial policy, the income policy, the regulatory framework. It's interlinked and challenging, but at the same time, we have a huge demand to do it and a political will to do it. We saw what we could do, political will through COVID. We changed things dramatically and we found trillions of dollars. Can we do the same for this? Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for those very important remarks and reminding us of the financial responsibility that's needed in order to address this sort of triple sustainability crisis that we have around environment, economic, and social progress. So this leads really nicely into the next presentation, which will give us insights at the sectoral level. And here, my colleague from the Sectoral Policies Department, Margarita Licata, will be talking about the circular economy, where certainly, we can think about, some of the financial impacts or some of the sort of cost savings one can even think about when dealing with the circular economy. Margarita heads up the services aspect of the Sectoral Policies Department. This includes work on retail, commerce, media, and cultural and financial services. She's also quite experienced in work on just broader social and labor market issues, as well as health and equality at work. I'll turn over the floor now to Margarita. Thank you.
Sometimes my voice goes down. I was already introduced by Marva, and maybe I will go straight into the presentation. What I'm going to do is first to give a bit of rationale around the study. Is a mapping exercise that we conducted in 2023. It's not a quantitative research, but it's really trying to map out some of the initiative, the policies around the circular business model, focusing on the retail segment of the supply chain. I will then dive into circular model in the retail clothing and in the electronic sector, always focusing on the retail part of it, because this is, I covered the commerce side of the supply chain. The study also covered food sector, but for the interest of time and also for this presentation, I will just focus on these two, and then I will provide some final considerations. Why this study? First of all, you will appreciate that circular economy is a model that redefines a bit the way in which we produce and which we consume. And its emphasis very much on the environment, right? And actually, the circular model was developed out of a response to environment and to mitigate environmental degradation. So what it means is that for a while, a lot of the focus was on the environment, and it neglected a bit some of the labor and social consideration. And so when you look at some of the circular activities, circular policies, they do not take into account this consideration. And it means also that not all circular jobs are per se decent jobs. The paper wants to, first of all, look at a bit the sectoral dimension, looking at these sectors that are quite wasteful sectors. They are very important for trade, both within region and between a region. They are highly integrated in trade, and that they all have some experience of emerging circular model when it comes to repair, resale, rental activities. And then we also found that in a lot of discourse, in a lot of meetings, we were part of some of the alliances, some of the working group. The focus was very much on manufacturing, on the recycling side, on the manufacturing side, but there was not really a reflection about what are the opportunity of circular model when it comes to retail. Let me maybe highlight some of the models, and maybe you are aware of those. Resale, repair, and rental. So resale and repair models are very much aimed at increasing, extending the longevity, the durability of a piece of clothes. The resale model actually does foster a second-hand market through, for example, thrift store, through online platform, but also the trade between region is quite important. Then you have a repair initiative that do actually provide both an opportunity to reduce the consumption, but they also provide an opportunity to increase the the space for enterprise development, a lot of the business around repair, and then we can discuss the quality of this business, but there is a lot of space there for employment creation, job creation. And then you have rental services. I will explain rental is not per se circular, but it does have, to a certain extent, an impact on a positive impact on the environment. The paper didn't focus per se on trade, but I wanted to highlight here how actually the global trade in second-hand clothes has been growing. And if you see here, this is some data that I gathered from the UN Comtrade. Between 2001 2021, there's been an increase in second-hand clothes in United States, in Europe. These are big exporters for second-hand clothes. And then you have also China, that it actually increased quite a lot in terms of export of second-hand clothes. Then you have a big importers, countries and regions that import, and you have Asia, 28%. And then you have, surprisingly enough, sorry, that is not super visible, but 24% Europe, and then followed by Africa. Now, if we go to the resale, so resale, and again, you can find more detail on the different models in the paper. You have both own product take back and resale organized by the shops, or you have general collection and resale. In this case, you do have providers, service providers that do export to other regions. We did look at some of the impact, and we look at some of the studies that were conducted in Africa. You do have a general positive potential for employment. If you look at, for example, the trading side, the washing, the repairing, the altering, but you also have some negative effect on the local retail market. You also need to consider that according to some of the study, a large proportion of second-hand clothes that are sent to Africa, this was the study that we reviewed, 40% of them are considered unwearable or unusable. So they go into the landfill. So they are not really used for sale. Some of these resale jobs are generally part-time, are temporary. They're very much female-dominated, and they are still part of the broader informal economy. They are often characterized also by a fast working space, physical burden, and time pressure. Let me go into rental. As I mentioned before, rental is not per se circular, but it's based on access. So people do not own the clothing, but they do access temporary clothing. This reduces in general the consumption. You have a different type of enterprise that have been developed around that. Small enterprises, you have big companies like online platforms. It's growing also in developing countries. There has been also, and this is something to reflect upon, you know, this kind of offset between positive and negative effect. There's an increase in logistics and transport that also can bring also an increase in CO emissions. So we need to analyze how this increased CO emission to balance and offset the positive impact for the reduced consumption. And this business model reflects also growth in certain type of jobs, in sorting, in logistics, in delivery jobs. ILO has been already analyzing these jobs and the quality of the working condition. So some of the studies that ILO already organized around this need to be taken into account when looking at the decent work in the rental space. And then you have the repair model in clothing. As I mentioned before, it aims at extending the lifespan of a specific piece of garment. The policy around repair at the moment are very much around the tax breaks, economic incentives. While many would say this is becoming part of this urban gentrification, where repairing is almost a cool thing to do, like you go to repair because you want to save the environment, yes, but this circular model has not been really new. I mean, repair is part of a tradition of many countries. I would say also including mine, Italy, where repair services are very well organized. India has a quite strong repair services. So often are not a choice. It's about an economic need that needs to be considered, and is still very much around informality. Now, some general consideration around the specific model, circular clothing model. Yes, so there are significant employment creation potential. The second-hand market for clothes in the global south is still part of the informal economy, and there are a number of decent work challenges there, but also I would say some negative effect on the local retail market, on the enterprise development in this market. There is a shortage of skill when you think about tailoring jobs, stitching jobs. And so there is a need to strengthen a bit the technical, the vocational training and professionalization of jobs around retailing, about tailoring, dressmaking, mending, and so on. What we found in this mapping is also we need to have due consideration for the social and cultural context we operate in when we want to shift from this ownership base to access base. There are class consideration, gender consideration to be made. And I would say also there has been a rapid growth of fast fashion that has actually eroded tailoring and stitching jobs, and has also eroded the skills around these jobs. So in India, for example, some of the traditional tailoring services have been very much undermined by the fast fashion. People buy clothes because they're cheap, so they don't need to repair it. Now let me move to circular model in consumer electrical and electronic equipment. Again, here, what the mapping did is to really review some literature around some of the practices. We focus less on the recycling effort. We cover mainly the repair and refurbishing practices because they're more linked to the resale, to the retail part of the overall supply chain. Again, here you do have a repair model that extend the life of an electronic piece of the electronic equipment, and this reduces waste. But you have also refurbishment practice where you restore the phone and then you sell it, and this also the affordability also create an incentive to buy a phone and not to buy a new phone. That also this reduce the overall consumption of electronics. Again, I tried to find a bit of a graph that represent the global trade in reused or refurbished electronic. I could not find really a clear map, but this shows a global trade in waste. And my message here is that the trade in waste, and if you see uncontrolled waste and used electronic equipment, by the way, so this is put together, it's much more complex. It's not just about between the global north and the global south. It's actually you have internal flows in between region of a trade on waste and on used electronics. There are considerations around the policy and the legal context. For example, some of the copyright issues, some of the legal barrier, they do also undermine the possibility to have a coherent, comprehensive right to repair framework. And this undermine the possibility to really develop repair services in this electronic space. We analyzed some of the cases again in Africa, Ghana and Nigeria. They do have a quite well-organized repair and refurbishing sector. Accra and Lagos, they employ more than 30,000 people. They make a living out of the repair and refurbishment. And you have some clusters in Nigeria that have more than 5,000 small enterprises that are all registered with local authority to pay tax, and they have more than 50,000 technician and salesperson. In Europe, you do have still a repair service that is organized around micro, small, and medium enterprises. In Western Europe, the cost of repair is still quite high, so there are a number of incentives. You can see more details in the paper, but there are subsidies, repair tax, repair fund, but also tax deduction around repair. Again, some of the implication here. You do have employment opportunity at the various skills level. However, especially in electronic, you have some safety and health consideration that need to be made. Repair workers tend to work in closed spaces without ventilation. They may have they may be exposed to solder paste that contain lead. And also linked to that, the quality of informal work is something that needs to be discussed, need to be addressed. There are gender disparities. Many of these work are quite technical and they're still men-dominated. And then you have all an issue about the issue about skills development. So from one end, you do have an increased demand for mid-skill jobs, low-skill jobs, but you have also an evolution of digital devices that will require a rethinking around the workforce reskilling, a continuous reskilling to make sure that the repair services are done properly. And then last but not the least, there are challenges around the scalability, the viability of the enterprises that operate in these services. And there is a need for more incentives, as I mentioned before, tax, subsidies, and so on. And the right to repair is something that still has the burden of the lack of, or the presence of legal barrier to it. My final consideration, maybe some key messages from the study. As I mentioned before, current economic, the current circular economy discourse has been very much technical, focusing on the environment. We need to bring more into the policies, into the strategy, the social and economic dimension, but also the employment dimension, social dialogue. Many of the circular jobs maybe are less unionized, maybe there are less linkages with employers' organization. But some of the issues, the employment issue that we discussed, the safety and health, working conditions, skills, they do require social dialogue. They require an engagement of the employers, of the unions. And linked to that, again, job quantity is important, but job quality needs to be factored in when look at the circularity, but also the social imbalances, why we do. If we want to shift to an access-based model, to a circular model, we need to consider the reason why people adopt these models. They may have a class implication, they may have a race implication or gender implication. This needs to be considered. The shift also needs to consider skills and the issues of reskilling, upskilling, if we want to have viable enterprises. Issue of the scalability and formalization is also very important. This means also how we ensure access to innovation, to finance, especially for micro, small, and medium enterprises. And then last but not the least, something that was mentioned by the previous speaker, trade in a circular model may have a shock on other dimension. It's not necessarily a positive thing. We need to also try to address the negative unwanted effect on the environment, on the jobs, on employment in general. And maybe I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita, for that fascinating presentation. Really thinking about one of the pathways towards sustainability while considering a number of the unintended consequences. And I think it's really important, as you mentioned, to try to mitigate some of these impacts. And I found particularly insightful the discussions about the informal economy, how it, has creativity and dynamism, but at the same time, one needs to be careful about the quality of these jobs. And that brings us really very nicely to the next presentation, which looks at the firm level and on a paper, Adopting Green Measures in Export and Firms. And the next presenters will be Nicolas Maitra and Piline Secular-Rishardi. Both Piline and Nikolai are researchers in the research department. Nikolai focuses on living wages as well as the just transition towards environmental sustainability. Piline's work is more on implication of trade, global supply chains, and environmental transitions. So I think the two nicely complement each other for the research going forward. So I'll turn it over to you. You have about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Marva, for this introduction, and welcome again to this workshop on trade, environment, and decent work. After having listened to interventions at the global and sectoral level, now we will turn to the firm level, and my co-author Nicola and myself will be presenting a paper entitled Adopting Green Measures in Exporting Firms: What are the Effects on Labor Market Outcomes? This paper has just come out actually as a working paper, and using the link indicated here and the QR code, you can download the paper from the ILO website. And this paper is the first research output of the project Trenna that Marva was mentioning at the beginning of her intervention, which focuses on these relationships between trade, labor, and decent work. So the idea behind this paper is linked to the debate on the link between international trade and environmental sustainability. Many have raised concerns about the impact of globalization on increased pollution and environmental degradation. And the role of enterprises has been particularly underlined in this context because firms, they can fragment their production across different countries, and they can also move their production and parts of their production to some countries where the environmental legislation is weaker. There have been many studies to look at this link between globalization and environmental sustainability, but they've been mostly at the macro level, and despite some positive findings, the results have been mostly inconclusive. And in this context, it might make sense to turn to firms, because we know that firms differ in terms of their environmental footprint, but also in terms of their participation in trade. And in this context, heterogeneities at the firm level can shed some light on inconclusive findings at the macro level. This is also important from a labor market perspective. We know from the literature that direct exporting firms are associated with better labor market outcomes, such as productivity, employment, wages, and skills. And also improving environmental outcomes in firms, such as implementing green measures, as we are focusing on here, have necessarily effects on workers. And then it is legitimate to ask whether combining these two activities, exporting and greening, would mean in terms of working conditions in firms. And this would help inform policy on how to create incentives for firms to adopt green measures while improving worker outcomes. So this paper has a double objective. First, we ask the question whether exporting firms adopt more green measures. And then we investigate whether working conditions differ in firms that combine exporting and green measures compared to other categories. And based on the availability of data, we focus on 4 labor market indicators: productivity, wages, education level, and the training offer by firms. So before I go further, I would like to clarify what we mean by greening. Here we focus on green processes that might sometimes called green process innovation and green measures, as opposed to green products. So we are looking at the measures that aim to reduce energy consumption, pollution, and waste linked to production. Nicola will later on give you more information about the exact measures that we are using in this paper. So now I will give a very quick overview of the literature, focusing on the topic that is of interest here. So at the firm level, first, if you look at the literature between on exporting and green measures, we find some theoretical channels that explain this relationship. First, exporting firms might be more might implement more green measures because they are more protective and they have the resources to do so. Secondly, they might face more pressure, not only from clients and authorities domestically, but also beyond their borders. Also, they might be exposed to they might be more exposed to green technologies through their trading activities. And if we take the argumentation the other way around, the causality the other way around, implementing green measures also may open up more opportunities for firms for exporting, especially to the countries where environmental legislation is more stringent. These are theoretical channels that are put forward, but when we look at the empirical studies, they are quite limited. But these studies tend to confirm a positive relationship between trading activities of firms and green investment, implementation of green measures. However, there are some nuances in these studies. Secondly, we look at the literature on the working conditions in exporting and greening firms. Actually, the literature which combines these effects and looks at their impact on working conditions seems inexistent. There are two streams of literature, of research in the literature. On the one hand, the studies that focus on the relationship between exporting and labor, and on the other hand, those looking at the relationship between greening and labor. And there are definitely more studies that look at the effect of exporting than that of greening. And what they find is for direct exporting only, they find that these firms, they offer on average more employment, higher wages, and they are more productive. But there are important heterogeneities across workers, which benefit to different extents from the exporting activities of firms. And if we look at the literature on the implementation of green measures or green innovation in firms and labor, from a theoretical point of view, this could increase productivity if the measures adopted increase the resource efficiency, for example, through the use of new technologies. Also, implementing green measures might increase the reputation of a firm, and the clients might be willing to pay more for the products, which would have a positive impact on productivity. But implementing green measures also implies costs, and these costs might reduce the competitiveness of the firm, at least in the short run. When it comes to the skills, in line with the literature on innovation, green innovation is expected to profit higher skills, but also different levels of skills are required, are necessary for green transition. As Margareta was mentioning, mid-level skills and also low-level skills are also required in different sectors for different occupations. For example, in recycling sector, we might not need high-level skills. Concerning wages, it is pretty much linked to the skills that are required. So if higher skills are required, then there will be a skill premium. These are the theoretical channels, but at the empirical level, there are very few studies, and they have nuanced findings depending on the type of measure that is implemented by the firm. So with this, I will give the floor to my colleague, Nicolas, to talk about data and the main indicators and the model.
Thank you very much, Pauline. So before we go into the main result of the paper, let me start by briefly giving you some information on the data and the main indicators that we use for the analysis. So first, regarding the data, in this paper, we use a series of World Bank enterprise surveys that were conducted between 2018 and 2020. This series of surveys were carried out by the World Bank in collaboration with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the European Investment Bank. In terms of country, the surveys cover 37 countries located in Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. And the surveys are representative of the firms in these countries. Now, in terms of income group distribution, the sample includes 13 high-income countries, 18 upper middle income countries and 6 lower middle income countries. Unfortunately, there is no representation of low income countries in the sample. Now, the total number of observation or the total number of firms in the sample is equal to a little bit more than 25,000 firms. And the average number of observation by country is around 700, but it varies very much from country to country. For example, it covers around 150 firms in Montenegro, but it can go up to more than 3,000 firms in Egypt. Now, a very important aspect of this series of enterprise survey is that in addition to the usual questions that are included in this type of survey, it also includes a green economy module, which with a set of questions on firms' behavior related to the environment and climate change. And this is what allows us to carry out our analysis. So now let me turn to the main variable that we use, or the main indicators that we use. And the first one relates to the identification of exporting enterprises in the data. In order to identify exporting enterprises, we use answers from the question, what percentage of the establishment's sales were national sales, indirect export, or direct export? Here we focus on direct exporter, and so enterprises are considered exporting if they report exporting directly at least 1% of their total sales. By using this classification, we found out that the share of exporter varies greatly from country to country, going from 2.2% in the Russian Federation to 55% in Slovenia. And the average share of exporter in the sample is equal to 18%. It's worth mentioning that as part of the robustness analysis that we carried for the paper, in addition to the 1% cutoff that we use for defining exporters, we also used other cutoffs, which are 10 and 20%. And using those different cutoffs, we found very similar results. So now let me turn to the second main variable or second main indicator used, which relates to the identification of the green enterprises. So from the perspective of enterprises, as Belin mentioned in the introduction, the greening of business can take many forms, but it can generally be classified into two streams or two categories. On one hand, we have the enterprises that offer or sell green products and services, and this refers to greening the output of the enterprise. And on the other hand, which can be also jointly carried out, we have the enterprises that are greening their process of production, or they implement green technology. And this refers to greening processes. And in our case, and in this paper, due to data availability, and because it was not possible to identify enterprises that are offering or are selling green products and services, we focused only on the adoption of green process and technology, so in the green process of production. In order to identify these green enterprises, we use a question from the green module of the survey, and the question asks whether over the last 3 years, the enterprise implemented any of the following measures. And then there is a list of 10 measures that have reducing impact on the environment. And for each of these measures, then the enterprise have to say yes or no if it implemented or not this measure. So we have in this measure the heating and cooling improvement, climate-friendly energy generation, machinery and equipment upgrades, energy management, waste minimization, air pollution control, water management, upgrades of vehicle, improvement of lighting system, and other pollution control measures. So once we have we use the answer from this question, we created 2 alternative dummy variables to identify green enterprises. And the first dummy, the first dichotomous variable, consider that a firm is green if it reports having implemented at least one of the measures that I just mentioned. That means the firm is engaging in some kind of green activities in the green transition. The second, the alternative variable, the second dummy variable, consider that a firm is green if it reports having implemented at least 3 of the measures that I just mentioned. Why 3? It's because it's just above the average, the number of measures that are implemented by enterprises in the sample. So that means that this enterprise is greening more than the average. So once we have created these main variables, or main indicator on whether a firm is exporting or not, and whether a firm is considered green or not, we can start exploring the first research question, which relates to, which seek to analyze if exporting firms are more likely to adopt green measures. So in order to try to answer this question, we first look at simple descriptive statistics on the share of enterprise implementing green measures among exporting firms and among non-exporting firms. And this is what we see in this figure for the whole sample of countries, but also for the different income group countries. And here we can see that the descriptive statistics show that the share of enterprises implementing at least one green measure, so engaging in the green transition, is higher among firms that export compared to those that do not export. In fact, 81% of exporting firms are implementing at least one green measure, while among non-exporting firms, this share is equivalent to 71%. And this trend is observable across all the countries, but also across the different income groups. And if we look at the country level results, that's not shown here, but it's almost true for all countries except for 4 countries in the sample. This descriptive statistic describe well the relationship between exporting and greening, but it doesn't consider the characteristics of the firms. But firms that export, they have certain characteristics in terms of their size, the sector in which they operate, and other type of characteristic that may also influence their decision to adopt green measures. So in order to control for these characteristics, we use 2 probit models. The first one estimates the effect of exporting on the probability of implementing at least one green measure, so engaging in the green transition. And the second, look at the effect of exporting on the probability of implementing at least 3 green measures, so more than the average. And we include a set of control variables to control for the firm's characteristics, which include the size of the enterprise, the age, the revenue, the level of revenue, if the establishment belongs to a group, if it receives public support, and if the firm invests in research and development. In addition to that, we also included industry and country fixed effects. So as we can see in the table here, we see the result for a sample of all countries, but also for the income group. And what we see is that after controlling for all the characteristics I just mentioned, firms have a significant, exporting firms have a significantly higher probability of engaging in the green transition and have a higher probability of implementing more green measures than the average firm. And this is true for the whole sample, for the high income countries, the group of high income countries, for the group of upper middle income countries. But for the group of lower middle income countries, the results are not significant. So it has to be mentioned. These results should be interpreted as correlation between export and green, and they do not imply a causal relationship. In this sense, export, as mentioned in the introduction by Pelin, export may impact the adoption of green measure through, for example, the increased capacity, increases resources that they can have. But at the same time, the adoption of green measure can also affect the opportunities of exporting for a firm, because it opens opportunities of exporting green products in the international market. So now regarding the explanation of why exporting firms are more likely to adopt green measures, there are many factors and reasons why exporting firms might be more likely to adopt a green measure. And the paper does not intend to review or to analyze all of them, but the data allows us to explore an interesting aspect, which is whether exporting firms are more likely to face environmental requirements from their clients and from their customers. And the results that we show here in this figure shows that while only 8% of non-exporting firms are facing environmental requirements from their clients, this percentage goes up to 17% among exporting firms. So it shows that exporting firms are clearly facing more requirements from clients and customers. This can also be driven by policies and regulation. For instance, stronger due diligence regulation might also increase the demand from clients for green certification, environmental certification. So let's now turn to the second research question, which seeks to analyze how the labor market outcomes varies in firms that combine export and green measures compared to other type of firms, for example, those that implement only green measures without exporting. And let me start by looking at labor productivity and wages. Before we show the results, let me quickly go through the model that is used to analyze the impact on labor market outcomes. So in the model, we set the relevant labor market indicator as the dependent variable, as it is shown in the equation. So the LMO refer to the labor market outcomes and is the four labor market indicators that we are analyzing are labor productivity, average wages, training provided by firms, and workers' education level. Then in the regressor, our variable of interest, and for which we will see the results, refers to a categorical variable that distinguish the following four categories. First, the firms that are not exporting and not greening. This will be our omitted category, so every result will compare to this group. Then we have the second group, which include firms that are not exporting but greening. The third group are the firms that are exporting but not greening. And the final group, the fourth group, are the firms that are combining both the export and the adoption of green measures. Since they are in the regression, we also include a set of control variable related to the firm's characteristics. And since they are continuous variable, there is an OLS regression is run for the labor productivity, average wages, and workers' education. Yeah. Yeah. And a probit model is run for the training provided by firm, because the training provided by firm is a dummy variable, yes or no, basically, if the firms provide training or not. Here it's worthwhile to note that since the model covers various aspects of the labor market, but also 4 different categories of firms, it does not intend to examine the direction of the causality between the variables, but it allows to examine if firms that combine export and the implementation of green measure are associated to better labor market outcomes, which I believe in itself, it has very important policy relevance. So let's first take a look at the results for the labor productivity. By the way, in the paper, labor productivity is calculated as by dividing the total annual sales of the firm by the number of full-time employees in the firm. The results of the regression are presented in this figure. As we can see, the coefficient associated to the green exporters, so the firms that are greening and exporting are in green, this is the green bar. In blue, it's the firm exporting but not greening. In yellow, it's the firm greening but not exporting. And the missing category are the firms that are not greening and not exporting. What we can see from the figure is that in general, exporting and implementing green measures are associated with higher level of labor productivity. On average, firms that combine export with the implementation of green measures, so the green bar, have even higher labor productivity than those firms that do only export or do only the implementation of green measures. So it's kind of a cumulative impact on the labor productivity. Keeping these results in mind, let's turn to the results on the average wages. And let's try to see if those productivity gains that we are observing are translating into higher wages for the workers. In fact, if we look at the result, this figure shows similar representation, but for average wages. If we look at the result, we see that the higher productivity that we saw earlier translates into higher wages only in high-income countries. In lower and upper middle-income countries, there is no significant effect on wage, and so it doesn't seem that the higher labor productivity translates into these higher wages. So in lower and upper middle-income countries, workers may not benefit from the productivity gains brought by exporting and greening activities. I give now the floor to Pauline to discuss the training and education level.
So then we turn to training offers provided by firms. And we see that firms that combine exporting and greening measures are more likely to provide training on average. So I'm talking about these bars for all countries. But relationship between exporting and training is quite weak in lower middle income and high income countries. We don't see any significant correlation between exporting and the training offer of firms. But on the contrary, the relationship between greening and training seems quite strong. In fact, this might be due to the type of skills that are necessary for some greening processes, such as waste reducing measures or machinery and equipment upgrades. So the skills that are necessary for putting in place that kind of measures might be obtained more easily and immediately through training at the firm. And that's why the firms might be more likely to provide training. But also there is an interesting finding here in the case of high income countries. We see that there is no significant relationship between exporting and training in these countries. But when we look at the firms that combine greening and exporting, the probability of firms of offering training increases. So combining exporting and greening makes the link with training stronger. And then we turn to the education level of workers, which is represented through the share of employees with a university degree. Here we can see that firms that combine exporting and greening tend to employ a similar share of workers with a university degree to those that only export. So firms that combine these activities do not necessarily have more workers with university degrees than those only export. Results are here pretty much driven by exporting, and this relationship between exporting and the higher education level of workers is well established in the literature. On the contrary, relationship between higher education and greening is unclear, and this can be seen through the insignificant results for all countries. So what are our conclusions? We had two research questions in this paper. The first one is, do exporting firms implement more green measures? And our response is yes. Exporting firms have a significantly higher probability of implementing green measures than non-exporting firms. And also, we have found that exporting firms have a significantly higher probability of implementing more green measures. This is 3 measures or more. When we look at the working conditions in exporting and greening firms compared to other categories, here we focus on the difference between exporting firms and those that combine exporting and greening. We can see that among exporting firms, those that implement green measures have on average a higher level of labor productivity, they offer higher wages, and they have a higher probability of offering training. This might suggest that incentivizing green measures in exporting firms might have positive implications that they go beyond their environmental effects, or at the very least, it shows that these measures they don't affect negatively working conditions. However, there are important nuances. Higher productivity translates into higher wages only in high-income countries, and workers in lower middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries may not benefit from the productivity gains brought by exporting and greening. And this suggests that measures to strengthen wage-setting mechanisms and labor market institutions, such as collective bargaining and minimum wages, can help keep wages on par with productivity. So I'll stop here, and we'll be very happy to have your questions for all of us. I'm not.
Thank you, Pauline and Nicola, for that very interesting presentation with useful insights. One takeaway that I have from that really is about making the business case for green measures, and this is a big discussion right now in at the WTO around some of these green measures and what they might do to the competitiveness of firms. So I think some of your results, particularly with respect to the improvement in productivity of firms, showing that you can complement green measures with improvements in productivity, as well as increase in training, although more certainly needs to be done to translate in these productivity gains into higher wages for workers. Okay, with that, we have some time left for a Q&A. We have about 30 minutes left.
Recording in progress.
And I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Please, if you have questions, you're online, you can put them in the chat and I'll have a look at them. But maybe we'll start with questions in the room. And I want to open up the floor first to Gul, who may have some comments from UNCTAD to complement some of Diana's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Gül Ünal. I work for UNCTAD as a senior economist along with Diana. Thanks a lot, first of all, for this very informative and excellent session, really. I have one micro and one macro question for Pelin and Nicola. Micro question is that why did you not look at total output when calculating labor productivity, but total sales? And my main question is, maybe I'm confused, or I didn't get the message well clear. So it would be really nice to get a clear message about the main policy suggestion coming out of your paper. So if exporting firms are more prone to adopt green processes, then shall we incentivize firms to export more? But of course, this is some sort of a little isolated picture, because if exporting firms or if don't export, then we don't have greenhouse gas emissions from transport, right? So then can we really arrive to a conclusion about so I'm not really sure what is the conclusion we're arriving about showing that exporting firms are more prone to implement green processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take a couple more questions and then before turning it over to the speakers. Anyone else have a question? There's some in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, Christoph, you're over there. Thank you.
Actually, I have a linked question to your question. Is also on the policy implications. So exporting firms apply more green measures. What is behind that? So what I can see is often that there are more green requirements for importing countries. So I think it's also important to look at the other side and see, look, it is kind of obvious because there are also more requirements on the side, for example, importing to the European Union. There are these special requirements, and exporting firms have to adapt to that. So we for example, myself, I'm responsible for a project looking into these questions, and there are a lot of looking. Then if you do here research work, but if you talk to the enterprises, you see that the enterprises say, look, when we export to the US market or to the European Union market, they ask us to reply to these environmental measures. There are also trade agreement with environmental safeguards and things like that. So it's also important, also if when you talk about the policy measures, to take into consideration also this aspect. Thanks.
And maybe I'll abuse my position as moderator to ask two more questions. One is to Margarita. And I thought it was really a fascinating presentation about the different models for circular economy. And you touched upon something with respect to resale and refurbishment that I wanted to come back to. And I wonder if, especially some of the unintended impacts on local labor markets. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because in the context of trade, you find particularly under some unilateral arrangements where some countries, such as in East Africa, have initially refused to take used clothing because of the damage that it's done to their local labor market. And I wonder if you look at the other side of the coin to see how some of this, this is a circular economy. So the idea is that the sale of used clothes should reduce the production at the source. And I wonder if you've seen any, sort of changes in production, particularly in Western countries, as well as Eastern countries, as a result of some of these policies. And then I have a question as well for Diana, which has to do with the point you made about support for industrial policy for these sort of triple objectives. And here I'm thinking about, some of the policies that at the domestic level that are being used to support a green transition, while at the same time putting limitations on certain types of trade. And I wonder if you have something to say about that, the balance between the two of those. So maybe we start with Piline and Nicola, and we move down. Oh, I'm sorry. And maybe one last question from Mustafa, and then I'll open it up. Do you have a question or you want to make a comment?
Maybe I can. Just a quick question. Yes, first of all, it was very insightful presentation and results of studies, but maybe a question for Margarita. Many countries have adopted extended producer responsibility, for electronics and so I was wondering if that applies in any ways for products that have their end of life in jurisdictions outside countries that have those policies, and to what extent you can operationalize extended producer responsibility beyond domestic jurisdictions. Thank you.
Okay, Piline and Nikolai.
Thank you very much for this question. Maybe I just answer the first question on the total output, total sales, and then you can answer the other one. Regarding total sales, in fact, total output is not in the database, so we use the proxy that is the closest, which is total sales, total annual sales.
Yeah, and thank you for these questions. First of all, I want to emphasize that this whole project, on trade, environment, and decent work, highlights the fact that we can't look at these issues at one level. So we need more research and more understanding at different levels. So this firm level paper will not respond to all micro level policy questions, but what is trying to do that first, there are two questions that are related there. The first one is looking at whether green exporting firms adopt more green measures, but the most important part is whether greening, whether implementing green measures done in exporting firms make a difference in terms of working conditions. So we are looking at that because not only working conditions, but also, as we're saying, productivity. So we are actually making a business case for greening, for implementing green measures, because there is always this fear that implementing green measures will decrease productivity or will lead to conditions that are worse because they imply costs. But in our database, we look at it and we see that actually it's not the case. When these exporting firms, they implement green measures, their productivity level is higher. And then there are some other labor market indicators that go up. So it's in itself, it seems it comes out as an important message for us. Don't get scared of implementing green measures, because you will lose productivity, or you will have to propose worse conditions. It doesn't come out from this study. This is the main thing. And also, why exporting companies adopt more green measures. We try to respond to these questions in the paper as well as in the presentation. You can come back to it if you want to. Go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, there is many factors that can explain why exporting firms are implementing more green measures. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there is this reverse causality that is not only exporting leads to adoption of more green measure, but it's also making green products can also open opportunities to the international markets. If you make green products that are competitive in the international market, there will be a demand for it, and it can open opportunities to export for the firm. So first, we have to keep these I think these two linkages, and then secondly, going back to the question, it is clear that one of the main driver is the regulation in the importing countries, and which in fact increase not only the right to import or not, but also increase the demand in the importing countries from the clients and the customers, which require more certification or more requirement in terms of environmental certification. Now, we also in the paper, we also looked at there is a question on whether the firm is facing energy tax levy or energy performance standard within the country in which they operate. And what we found is that the exporting and the non-exporting firms were facing the same level, similar level of kind of environmental regulation, meaning that there is not an environmental discrimination for exporters and non-exporter in the domestic market, but it really comes from the market abroad.
Thank you. Maybe for the question from Marva. So what we reviewed is mainly impact on the enterprise development at the country, the importing countries. So when you have a second-hand market that comes into a region, obviously that can have an impact also on the production of local clothes. And so that can discourage enterprises in that space, local enterprise, but also the type of jobs, they are very different. So if you have a second-hand market with that comes into a specific region where you import clothes. First of all, the quality of the product is not good. The clothes are not good. And then you do have, as I mentioned before, a lot of these goods are not sellable, so they go into landfill, and you have all the issue of waste and waste collection that is a lot informal. I cannot say that you can find this kind of correspondence between an increase of second-hand market and a decrease in consumption. There's still, I think, a challenge in the consumption, also due to fast fashion. So it's we still cannot see that kind of the balance. Second-hand markets grows, and suddenly, automatically, the reduction of consumption is there. I think there are many factors that need to be considered when you look at the increase in consumption and how you can reduce actually that consumption. For the question from Kamal, this mapping exercise didn't look at the extended producer responsibility in terms of the challenges for implementing these schemes outside. We did a very quick review applied to electronics, and we look at some of the challenges linked to, for example, extended producer responsibility scheme. They are not well integrated with the national waste management policy. So we look at very much at the country and how they are implemented in the country. And some of the literature review also suggested that at the moment, these schemes are very much focusing on recycling and less on the refurbishment and repair of product. So maybe that could be actually an interesting research question about how this extended producer responsibility scheme can be actually implemented outside the national legislation.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for your question. Thank you, everyone, for the presentation. It's really interesting. I also have a question for Pelin, but if I can just deal with the one you asked me first. Thank you for that. So very interesting. I was at a World Trade Organization public forum meeting last week on exactly the question you've raised about the use of industrial policy. And the room, first of all, the room was packed. I mean, standing room only, because this is a question that everybody is interested in. And the swing of the pendulum now is really much more in favor of industrial policy than we've seen for a long time, which is encouraging to UNCTAD and ILO, because I assume, because, we've argued for industrial policy pretty comprehensively for a very long time. So, it's encouraging to see that this recognition that some sectors really need support to be able to get on their feet, to develop the capacity, to take risks, to be innovative, to do all the things that are really going to be needed when we're making this big shift into an unknown world. So as I say, the room was packed, and the messaging was very much that industrial policy could and should be used by countries, that government subsidies to try and help support new and innovative sectors, could be in the toolbox. Ideally not applied unilaterally, ideally not applied without thought to impacts on other countries, but that this is a mechanism that really should be part of the government toolbox. And in our own UNCTAD field case studies, we did a very interesting study of Indonesia, where last decade, Indonesia used export bans on its deposits of rare minerals. And they used the export ban for a while, temporarily, to get the domestic industry sufficiently ready that it could actually be involved in the processing of this rare mineral, not just the extraction of it. And so that was a very important, buying some time so that they could then actually be part of the value added mechanisms that, in this extremely valuable resource. So this idea of opening gradually, you know, when you've got some capacity, it's an infant industry argument, but it's got a particular resonance now as, you know, countries are really having to respond in quite dramatic ways. With the Global Plastics Treaty that's under discussion now. I mean, UNCTAD developed a database that shows the trade in plastic. It's hugely important. It's $1 trillion worth of trade every year. That's not counting the domestic production, obviously. And many countries are very, very exposed in plastic, including in textiles. You had your recycle example. So there's a big push to develop a more circular economy when it comes to plastic. But also at the same time, it would be advisable to make less of these problematic plastics, especially the single use. Now, some countries are massively exposed to it. It's 10 or 15% of their exports. So how are they going to change their industry structures to get this goal that their own countries want and many other countries want, but in a way that also the transition shock is not too inequitable and too dramatic. So, for example, in the textile sector, we did some interviews with textile companies, and we find that they're very responsive to the demands of markets, particularly export markets where consumers want a particular environmental standard to be met. And so that's a strong incentive for the company to do it. But they're not thinking yet about these trade policy implications because it hasn't come through yet through the consumer demand. But when it does come, it's going to be a shock. So there will be a need for some industrial policy here to help the firms change their processes and to maybe reskill the people, which just thinking about this, the iPhone, we've got 20 people in the room, probably 18 of us have got an iPhone. The iPhone was developed with the benefit of massive industrial policies, subsidies and support. And it's a product which is now, I don't know if it is still receiving these subsidies and industrial policy support, but it's a product that went from, an idea to a ubiquitous consumer product, thanks to a huge amount of this industrial support. That, in a way, that segues into the question I wanted to ask Pelin. Pelin, you said that the higher productivity in the companies that are bringing in green initiatives and that are exporting, that the benefit of higher wages is only coming about in high-income countries. I found that really interesting. So why is it that the companies in the low-income countries who are doing this same thing, why are they not benefiting from the productivity gain? Thank you.
We did not analyze the question in a deep way, but what we were thinking, our intuition was that wage setting mechanisms in these countries are lower. So then the gains of productivity that are brought about by exporting and greening are distributed towards the capital owners, but not towards the workers. So this is our intuition. And in these countries, there might be a need to strengthen these institutions so that the wages will be on par with productivity gains. So this is clearly, this needs more analysis, but
Next
this is our intuition, but maybe Nicola would like to add to that.
I think another reason that comes in mind is the type of labor market, which is characterized by lots of informal workers, and the labor supply is there is a more labor supply than labor demand. So the enterprise, if the workers are asking for more wage to be on par with the productivity, they can more easily replace the workers, and I think this also contributes to the issue.
Yeah, I wonder if you tried some link with trade union density as well between the different countries to see if there was some reason why you might have more of a follow through.
I tried, but the data on trade union density were not very much significantly different, you know, from on average in the income group.
Okay.
For example, the average of the lower middle income group are not so different on average than the upper middle lower.
Okay. I have a question in the chat, and then there's a question from Mustafa as well. Would that be all right? Yeah. Okay. This is from Veronica Wotzak, and she has a question specifically to Margarita. And she said she found it very interesting, but clearly there are many opportunities here. And she wondered how we can accelerate this shift to a circular economy. One problem seems to be that often repaired or used goods are in the end are not much cheaper because it's costly to organize the resale and repairs. As a result, consumers will likely opt for new products. Are there any discussions on how to break that dynamic? For example, by taxing products using only new materials more, or tax exemptions for used products? And Mustafa had a question as well. Yeah, do you want to?
Well, I can come first, but I was more of a comment that, you know, I think was triggered by Diana's remarks on industrial policy. And I just wanted to mention that last year at the Labour Conference, in the general discussion on just transition, the topic also covered industrial policy. And this, you remember, when governing bodies set this agenda item for the conference, it was the workers' group that insisted that the discussion should also include a consideration of industrial policy. So this to say that this debate on the importance of industrial policy today is also very present in the ILO. But obviously, you know, if you put it in a broader context of advancing social justice, there are also elements of social justice, because if you want to use massive public injection to support industries, we know all countries don't have that same capacity to provide subsidies and government support. So, you know, would that not lead to some extent distortions in production capacities around the world and then trade implications? So the objective itself of industrial policies is shared, but I think the modalities of that happening across the world at the same time, not undermining social justice is important. And I was just also wanting to say on what you're saying about critical energy transition minerals, the same issues are being addressed there. And as you know, this is why the UN Secretary General has put in place a panel on critical energy transition minerals, where UNCTAD and UNEP are serving as secretariat. So I serve for the ILO in the technical advisory group. And I think if you see the guiding principles that I think the panel submitted to the Secretary General on the 11th of this month, many of the issues we talk about here, recycling, the circular economy, the value-added industrial policy, and benefit sharing, you know, reference to labor standards, fundamentals, they're all in there. And I think that's a very, very good first step towards, you know, more social justice in the use and development of critical energy transition minerals, because they will play a very, very central role in the future for the energy transition, but also for the automotive industry and many other sectors of manufacturing.
Hi, everybody. This is Thomas de Klerk, UNEP UN Environment Program. Thank you for the very interesting session. Thank you also for the collaboration, ongoing collaboration, UNEP, ILO, addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity, and pollution, and then linking it to the world of work. I wanted to see, Margarita, you had 3 examples of deep dives on the sectoral work streams on high impact sectors. I see these 3 sectors indeed high impact sector in terms of environmental footprint, again on climate, biodiversity, pollution, as well as then the dimension, the social dimension, the employment dimension. I wonder if that was a particular reason for choosing these three sectors, food, electronics, and textiles, if there are other plans to focus on other high impact sectors. I saw a few times mentioned plastics was there, and also then linking it to policy coherence and trade. Is that approach to take forward to go deep dives into high impact sectors or more cross-sectorally as well in that regard? So forward-looking question in that regard. Thank you very much.
Maybe any last question before I turn it over to Margarita there too? Please go ahead. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Nanya Sudhir from Social Protection. This is not a question, more a comment. Sorry about that. I came into the room with questions. Actually, I was watching online. It was very interesting, and I thought it was very well linked together as well, the different areas. And I just wanted to, say that my question was going to be, how do we make this more of a priority? And then also, by asking exporting firms, by seeing that exporting firms are more likely to focus on adhering to standards, aren't we kind of also penalizing the exporting firms of developing countries? But this is a different question. But I feel like your answers have answered those questions. So I just want to say thank you, and just took the opportunity. It's a small room. So I don't know if you want to ask a question, please. Maybe, I don't know.
Just this, maybe a small technical one again, but one little comment and then one question about the link between, industrial policy and trade, which you raised an excellent point, Marwa. I just want to highlight that, industrialization or development is an end and trade is a means. And most often we forget that in the policy space, and we really need to ensure that the means should really support the end. And it often seems like it, it doesn't, and there's a lot of room for debate and research. So I really appreciate this workshop and the work on this. Maybe about the low income, of course, labor disciplining and the very high share of informal employment, I believe is definitely affecting the law, how white doesn't translate, the productivity doesn't translate into high wages. But maybe your sample is a bit small for low middle income. You don't have even low income. So, that may be something to explore further. If you have data, you have only 6 countries, I think, from low middle income. I don't know if you have a big enough sample size to generalize your conclusion on that. Just a comment.
Okay, thanks. Maybe before I turn it over, I'll abuse my position again. Just one final question. I wonder if you could say something, I had it marked from the beginning, about what type of green measures are you finding? Because you had a list of green measures. And I wonder if there were any particular green measures, did you unbundle them in some way to see which ones were having most of the impact in terms of productivity or wage gains? And I'll turn it over to Margarita.
Thank you. Let me start maybe with a question about why these sectors. Just so from the first slide, yes, there are wasteful sector, there are integrating trade, but we also started from sector where we already did a lot of work. As a sector policy department, we organized, it was a technical meeting on e-waste. There is a lot of work done by my colleague, Casper Edmonds, on electronics. So there was a lot of literature coming out of that. We are part of Sustainable Fashion Alliance, so we did a lot of work on the textile and clothing sectors. And then my colleague working on agriculture did a lot on food. So we really tried to put together everything and review everything that was already done in the sectors. But for sure, we do not exclude the possibility to do more research in sector like plastic. I think it's very interesting because also plastic is not just sector, it's used also for other sectors like textile, for example. On the question about why we don't do more on this circularity, I think that there are more and more incentives. Like I mentioned before, there are incentives for repair, because the labor cost for repair in some countries is very high. So you have incentives, you have you have subsidies, you have a tax reduction, you have VAT reductions. but there's the issue of scalability, how you make these enterprises and operating in the space of repair, of rental, more scalable, more viable enterprises. And then I think that the development of circular model, I believe, is still a bit delinked from all the discussion around fast fashion. Fast fashion is still there. And even when you want to have measure to reduce fast fashion, you need to think about the implication for countries like Asia, in Asia, that do survive on manufacturing. How you're going to make sure that there are measures that also support the effect that, for example, shifting from manufacturing to service like circular service model. How do you make sure that the workers they do have access to specific social safety net, for example? So there is a need to sort of combine this kind of trend like circular model and issues around reducing the fast fashion that is still very much in the agenda of many countries, especially manufacturing countries.
Okay, thank you. Just one more. Oh, I'm sorry. Nicola wants to follow up on that point, and then Diana, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, just wanted to answer the question. Very relevant comments that you made about the sample size and the number of countries that are included in the income groups. I mean, those conclusions that we are showing comes with all the limitations that are due to the data availability and the number of countries that are possible to include in the sample. And I completely agree with you that, but I think it highlights an interesting finding that can be further investigated, maybe even at the country level with better data on enterprises, maybe enterprise survey from the national statistical offices. With more observation and go really further into one case study can be very interesting. Also because what we found, even though the countries in the income groups are limited, even like this in the upper middle income countries, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the country level results that we can have. So I just want to mention that are averages, but if you go in depth at the country level, you will find that it's not always the case. That in some countries, wages are aligned with the productivity gains. It's not the case in other, but that's are all averages. So just to take with care these findings, and then responding to your question, Marva, on the type of green measures. We did not go in depth on the analysis of the impact on the type of green measure, but what we did is to look at what are the most commonly implemented measures by firms. And we found that usually the measures that are more commonly implemented are resource efficiency measures, as opposed to, for example, air pollution control measures. If we do three groups, so the resource efficiency measure, which reduce the input of the firms, then you have the air pollution measures and the waste minimization measure. And it's kind of logical because there is a business rationale to implement a resource efficiency measure. It's at the same time you can say that you implement a green measure, but at the same time it's beneficial for the economical purposes. So
I think Diana wanted to make some notes.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to just comment very briefly about what kind of measures firms and enterprises are using. What we've seen in our UNCTAD work, which I think is a nice complement to what you've been doing. So the firms that we interviewed in our country studies, typically the main green measure that companies use is to do with energy. And obviously trying to reduce the use of fossil fuel as a source of electricity or energy and moving to solar. The other thing was also sometimes the use of water trying to have less waste going into the system or to be more efficient in the water. What we don't see, well, what I didn't find in my case studies, I don't see much changing of industrial processes or products, you know, which is a different thing. The energy and the water, of course, is super important, but also how are we going to get these changes in industrial production and the products? And one of the reasons maybe that it's not happening so much is that it's quite difficult to get finance for that. If you're trying to get green finance, one of the easiest and most accessible avenues is for greening energy. And there are funds that exist for that, and banks can lend to it because they can see also that there's going to be a revenue stream that comes from it relatively quickly, because you're still producing, you know, your viable exportable product. What you've just changed is kind of how you're driving the machinery. Also, when you look at the bonds, some of the climate bonds, for example, they, of the ones that do have dedicated end uses already defined, they also tend to focus on things such as energy, and they're not looking necessarily at changing the inputs into the productive process. So those mechanisms don't exist. And that is one of the reasons why I finished my own presentation about urging more and better support for the public banks. And, you know, these government tools, they're owned by governments, they're owned by all the countries who come in our meetings. If they could better capitalize and better support their banks, these will be the sources of the funds for these kinds of changes. Thank you.
Thank you. And with those last remarks, I'll close the seminar. I just want to thank those of you in the room who remained to the end, as well as those online. You could have been anywhere else. You could have been starting your lunch, but you're here with us. So thank you for your participation. And thank you to all of the speakers. These were excellent presentations. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.